I especially have this problem with Security Breach and Ruin and wanted your thoughts. We can't. Thank you for...
Ladies, gentlemen, and those with the good sense to do away with the whole notion, I welcome you to the premier audio medium for all your Fazbear entertainment needs. The Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. Note, FFPP is not responsible for any loss of appetite, disinterest, dismemberment, or other legally classified statuses. So strap
Hello,
in
everybody. Welcome
and
back to the
enjoy.
Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast. I'm your host, the Toast, Right Toast, here to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's, as we always do. I did a classic thing where I couldn't think of a thing to talk about in time for needing to record this. So I'm just doing an Oops All Questions episode, and if we run out of questions, I'm just going to add more because I want to get like a good 45 minutes out of this. So we'll see what happens. If you want your questions answered on the podcast, feel free to send them into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. That is in the description, copy and paste because it's a pain to type out. I go newest to oldest, so if it's been like a month and I never brought up your question, feel free to just send it again, to be honest. They get lost. Our first question comes in from Geminia, they, them. After reading the comments on the Elizabeth video you recently posted, a consideration came to my mind. Specifically, is it possible Michael was conscious/possessed, depending on your approach, the entire time he was Ennard's skin suit, and also that he communicated with them, the spirits? This largely stems from Michael's "they thought I was you" comment. I always took this more as a guess as to their thoughts, as Sister Location presumably covers all of Michael's interactions with the Fun Times, and they never say they believe he is William. So he could have just guessed it, but realistically the situation would present a situation where Michael can communicate, or maybe even just eavesdrops on Ennard's thoughts and conversations with itself. This, I think, is especially prudent if you take the approach that he is possessing his body, as using the memories return when you find your body rule. He should find his body fairly quickly, as Ennard starts using his body and walking around everywhere, and potentially also using his house. In which case he is now possessing his body with his memories, probably for the majority of Ennard using it. While this doesn't really change any actions Michael may have done, as his motivations is quite spelled out in his monologue, I think it could provide more insight to his actions, if you consider he is potentially aware of everything Elizabeth and the other Fun Times could have either explicitly mentioned or spoke about in his presence. Thank you for your question. It's an interesting thought, right? The idea that either he was conscious while being worn, or he already was possessed himself. I do want to say, I think the difference is in the minigames. And we'll go back to what it would mean if this is true. I think as counter evidence to this, in the minigames that we see Michael possess his own body, the whites of his eyes only appear after he gets back up when Ennard leaves, right? Like he's walking around without the lights in the eyes as Ennard, and then after Ennard leaves and he kind of stands back up, then the dots appear in his eyes. So I think that's kind of our sign that he's not present until that moment. However, where was he during that time? That's a good point. The idea that maybe he was conscious while Ennard was wearing him is a terrifying possibility. I think I brought up at some point that Michael's body is kind of like a springlock suit in that moment where, working like a springlock suit, instead of a human going inside of a robot where all of the robot's insides are pushed to the wall so the human can fit, it's now a horrible reverse of that, where a robot is putting on a human body and all of their organs are pushed to the sides so the robot can fit. So he's kind of like a biological springlock suit in that way, which I think is done on purpose. I think that's a direct parallel that Scott was making. So there is a horrid possibility that because there's already remnant in and injected into his body from the scooper, that it's keeping him alive during all of that, which would be probably excruciatingly painful, right? So there is the possibility that he's alive while it's happening. He dies when Ennard leaves, and that's when he possesses his body. Also a possibility. But going more into your theory, if this is true, what does that mean, right? If Michael's spirit or consciousness is able to communicate with, or at least overhear, the spirits within Ennard, I think you bringing up "they thought I was you" is a valid point, because by all intents and purposes, I don't think Circus Baby did. Right? Circus Baby talks to Michael, going like, oh, you're new. The last guy tried this. And then, like, you know, is talking to Michael and scoops Michael, says you won't die to Michael. And Elizabeth, as Circus Baby, seems to be well aware who William is, right? So she never calls you daddy or father or anything in sister location, which makes me think, like, she knew you're not William. So is the they the Fun Times? That's very possible. Is the they the Biddy Babs? That's possible as well, right? And I think this gets doubled down with Ennard's, like the Ennard defense thing at the end of Night 5, where one of the lines you can get is, isn't this why you came here to be with her again? That could go either way, but it feels like something that would be said to Michael more than something that would be said to William. That's my, because, like, you know, isn't this why you came here? Well, William went there, presumably, a lot to do experimentation and things. So, like, again, it's weird that he says, they thought I was you, when clearly Elizabeth didn't. So this is likely the Fun Times. But then, to back to your point, the Fun Times don't really talk to Michael while he's down there. Funtime Foxy never speaks to Michael while he's down there. Funtime Freddy just has his insane ramblings, and Ballora just has her little song. So, like, when would he know that? Outside of, as you're suggesting, either talking to or overhearing them during Ennard wearing Michael. That would make a lot of sense. And, you know, we know they had these conversations from the source code. So maybe while that's happening, he can hear these conversations. And in it, you know, they're like, we killed William. And Elizabeth is like, that's not William, dummies. And then that's when it's like, oh, they thought I was you. Right? That is super, that makes a lot of logical sense. But I think I go back to the evidence we have in front of us makes it seem like he doesn't possess his body until after Ennard leaves, because of those whites of the eyes appearing after the fact. Counterpoint, they appear after he stands up. So it's obviously not like a clear thing. He possessed his body to stand up first, right? And again, this is an abstract representation of what has happened. So how much of it is supposed to be taken directly, literally, it's hard to say. Granted, Scott probably only did that eye thing to differentiate that versus Ennard, because if his eyes were lit like that the whole time, then someone might assume that some of the robot is still inside Michael, especially since the glowing eyes is how we see Ennard has entered Michael in that epilogue where we see the Rick Astley silhouette. So it is really up to interpretation, and my only direct counter argument is interpretive at best. So I would say that's an interesting theory. I don't know how possible it is, but it does color Michael's motivations in an interesting way. That would be another way to confirm Michael knows about all this supernatural stuff, and might be why he tries to reach out to the crying child, a la like during FNAF 3 through the logbook, right? So I like it. I don't know if I believe it, but I do like it. But thank you for your question. Our next question comes from Logan, him. Once you deactivate Roxy, Helpy pops on screen and says you are leaving the VANNI network functioning area. Wouldn't that mean the occipital nerve chip stops working temporarily? With that being said, couldn't the same be said for Gregory? Because if he also had an occipital nerve chip, then wouldn't it also have stopped working when you head down to the Burn Trap boss? Meaning that Burn Trap, the FNAF 6 pizzeria, does look like that, and the Blob Tangle are real. Thank you for your question. A couple things to that. One, Helpy is the one saying that it's disabled, so like, how much can we trust Helpy? Is he just lying so we lower our guard? Total possibility there. Not to mention it's done right after Roxy's deactivated, which it's like Roxy's the last security node, and she very clearly isn't. We just deactivate her like we do Sun Moon. So I think it was just because Roxy was getting in the way very clearly, because Helpy was trying to kill her that whole time with the forklift and such. So, one, can we trust Helpy when he says we're leaving the zone? Like, is that a real thing, or is he just saying that? Two, while it is true that if we are to assume he's being truthful, that we are leaving this zone, by the time we get into the area with the mimic and stuff, we can use the mask again, and we can look around and stuff. So by that time, I assume we're back in the network, right? I assume that's what we're talking about here. So at some point in that basement, it starts working again. So all this to say, even if he is telling the truth, by the time Gregory would have gotten down there, it seems like he would be back in network again. But we have more important information. One of them being that the blob we know is real, and that's because Cassie sees it before obtaining the mask. In the very beginning of Ruin, she sees the blob running away, which, like, that's evidence that the blob exists, because at that point she's just a normal girl who saw that. So the blob is real, and it has escaped by Ruin. So I guess counterpoint, we don't need to assume all this, that the blob is real, because Cassie sees it beginning of Ruin. That being said, Burn Trap is still an issue, and so is the FNAF 6 Pizzeria. I think the FNAF 6 Pizzeria is likely more real than it is not real, just because of how consistent it's been throughout everyone who's seen it. Gregory, Cassie, and Cassie's dad and Help Wanted too. As far as Burn Trap goes, I think he's still the big question mark. I don't think we can ever rule out Burn Trap's appearance because of the way the occipital nerve chip works, and because Cassie's starts working again, eventually within the FNAF 6 Pizzeria. So I guess that's all my thoughts on that, but thank you for your question. This is another outfit for the Lord Professor. You know, just like a sweater with a white shirt and collar sticking out. Another like academic look. I like it. It's very comfortable. The problem I'm running into is that it's very tight, but in like a cozy way, like a comforting tightness because it's soft and stretchy. But that makes me almost too cozy, and it's making me tired. So I'm running into that like trouble to keep my eyes open again. It is also 11:30 p.m., so there's that too. But this one might be rough to record it. I don't know. Maybe if I'm like walking around and standing up, it'd be a different story. I am sitting down and quite comfortable after all. The next question comes from Catherine, she, her. My query for you today is thus. With so many different ways of altering perception, illusion discs, nightmare gas, AR chips, etc., in the newer FNAF games, how can we be 100% sure that anything we see can be taken at face value? I especially have this problem with Security Breach and Ruin and wanted your thoughts. We can't. Thank you for question. No, could you imagine? That is one of the things that is very frustrating about FNAF now, because at least before Help Wanted, we could all agree that for the most part, what we saw is what we got. What we are seeing is what is true. Then Help Wanted introduced the indie games angle. So now everything before Help Wanted is up to suspect. Is that something that happened, or is that an embellishment from the indie game developer? Right? And Security Breach, Ruin, and Help Wanted 2 are all tainted by the VANNI mask. Every one of those protagonists likely wore a VANNI mask at some point, and likely received that same occipital transponder, which means AR stuff can appear in their vision whenever is wanted, you know? So, short answer is no. We really can't take anything currently in FNAF at face value. The next part of that answer is moving forward, we are probably going to be able to again. Secret of the Mimic, so far, knock on wood, has nothing like this, right? It's not an indie game, and as far as we know, dear God, and the VANNI mask hasn't been introduced yet. Illusion discs are something made by William, which this is Edwin's factory. Nightmare gas is something done by William, which is Edwin's factory. So theoretically, everything we see in Secret of the Mimic should just be true, which is huge news, you know? And moving forward, continuing the story in the current era, you know, Glitch Trap likely probably can still affect the occipital transponder, but for the most part, I think what we see after Secret of the Mimic is also going to be mostly true, at least if not fully, right? Because either it's Gregory, or I don't think we're playing as Cassie in the next game. That'd be crazy. Probably Gregory again, maybe Vanessa if we're lucky, trying to finish everything. And at that point, you know, we won't be using the VANNI mask, very likely. So the short answer is no. The short answer is there's no way. There's no way to be 100% sure. The long answer is Secret of the Mimic. It depends on the time period of the game, where it's placed in the franchise, and hopefully moving forward. But thank you for your question. Our next question comes from Angelic Mads, she, her. Based on Doughy, this is a Poppy Playtime theory, by the way. Based on Doughy, we now know toys can have multiple people. Depending on how far back Playtime was doing this, could the prototype have 2 people in it? Rich and Elliot are my main contenders. Rich has been around since chapter 1 and has been in every chapter since then. He's a weird character to stick around and hasn't done anything. Elliot is an obvious answer for who the prototype is, so this is a great way to subvert expectations. This theory is a great explanation for why the prototype has kept the orphans around, but also why the prototype seems so angry. Another reason for Rich to still be around is that he might also be our player character. But that's just a theory. Again, thank you for your question. A couple notes. One, I think I don't agree with the prototype being multiple people, because in the Doughy experiments, the documents we get, it seems like it's a very novel thing that Doughy is multiple people, because they constantly talk about, like, I don't know if this is going to work. If this doesn't work, we have a giant hulking Play-Doh monster who's going to kill us all. We need to make sure this is perfectly balanced. We don't know if this is even like, it feels like they don't know if it's possible when doing it for Doughy. So I would hesitate to say that there's, like, Doughy is not the first one they've done. And we know the prototype predates Doughy. So on the face of it, I don't think the prototype is multiple people, especially since the prototype can mimic human speech. So, like, how would we even differentiate or know that there's multiple people in there? It already sounds like there's 20 people in there, right? That all to say, putting that aside, if there are 2 people in the prototype, Elliot and Rich does make a lot of sense. I mean, it's an easy go-to because Elliot and Rich are kind of the 2 top contenders for who the prototype is at all, right? I think as the days go by, I lean more toward Rich because Rich is described as, like, a good person with an anger issues problem, which I could see being a twisted version of the prototype, right? Like a good goal, but the anger issues have taken over, you know? That being said, I also think the experimentation angle always makes me lean for Elliot. And I, for a while, was thinking, like, Elliot can't be in the prototype because it's so obvious that Elliot is the prototype that it's too obvious and they're going to subvert expectations that way. But I had the exact same thought about Ollie, that I was like, I know Ollie is a voice over the phone, and we are told that the mimic can mimic, or the mimic, God, we're told that the prototype can mimic voices. So I know that it makes sense for Ollie to be the prototype, but it's so likely, and it's so, like, on the nose that obviously it's a double blind, and it's going to be a subversion. And then it just was true. Like, Ollie just was the prototype, which, like, that makes sense. That's a good twist for the people who aren't, like, super, like, into the lore like we are. So, like, after that happened, I'm like, okay, maybe Elliot is the prototype. Right? Like, maybe Elliot is the prototype and it's not that deep. It's not trying to be this huge twist that you never saw coming. It's trying to be a satisfying story. Right? I think that's where I have to land on with Poppy Playtime, is that Poppy Playtime is giving us a really interesting story with really compelling lore. But they're not trying to get you. They're not trying to subvert you at every corner. I think, you know, and I'm relieved to say this, I think Poppy Playtime is prioritizing a satisfying narrative over an unsolvable one. You know? I think that's a really refreshing take in indie horror, that they'd rather make something that feels good than something that is really hard to solve, you know? So I think I lean always that the prototype is just going to turn out to be Elliot. And he hid that fact from Poppy for some reason, right? But that's why he and Poppy are different, because they are more perfect conversions into toys that don't need sustenance to survive. And also, they're different because they are related. So that's honestly what I'm thinking. The only other option is that Elliot had a son, and made the son the prototype because of the whole a duffel bag of a boy's remains was found at Elliot's residence. Maybe that was Ollie. Who knows? But that is still a loose end that needs to be answered. But I think when it comes down to it, if there are two people in the prototype, I think you're right that Elliot and Rich make the most sense. But I don't think there's two people. I think it's just Elliot. I think it just Elliot makes the most sense with what they've established so far in the series. But thank you for your question. Our next one comes from Gavin. He, him. Do you think FNAF could benefit by having more human villains, like how William was before getting springlocked? Yeah, it's a weird question, right? Because I think FNAF's biggest strengths are in the fact that the main story is never the main plot. Right, I've talked about this a few times in the FNAF is Unsolvable and on previous podcasts, where FNAF's biggest strength, in my opinion, is that the plot of the games isn't the main story you're trying to solve, right? Each individual game is like the aftermath or the surrounding context for the different story that you're trying to solve, right? Like FNAF 1's main story is you're just defending yourself from animatronics, but that's the plot. But the story of that game is that they're possessed because of the missing child incident, which is something you have to find out. That's a separate thing. So I think it gets messy, right? When considering what is a FNAF villain and is their presence felt in a game. Where like Glitch Trap is kind of / the Mimic at this point is the main antagonist of the series. But is the Mimic the main villain of Security Breach? Well, technically, it's the animatronics, which, sure, the animatronics are being powered by Glitch Trap, but FNAF is in a weird position villain-wise, right? Like, what is the villain of Help Wanted 2? Is it Glitch Trap? I guess. It's weird, right? So, all this to say, yes, FNAF could benefit from having more human villains, but to your question specifically, like how William was before getting springlocked, this leans into, I think, my favorite characterization of a FNAF villain. And that is, like, the showman. The over-the-top, giddy, gleeful showman. I think that is probably the most effective kind of a FNAF villain I could ever want, is that big, like, kind of like the characterization that JT Music has been doing in his recent songs. He did Reflection, which is a song about the Mimic, but the one line that really sticks out in that song for me for, like, characterization of a FNAF villain in Reflection is, like, I'm the director, my actors are talentless, so I'll control it all, or something like that, and make sure no one is autonomous. The idea of, like, I'm putting on a show. This is me putting on a show. And then Hat Trick triples down on that. Hat Trick is an excellent song for characterization of William Afton, in my opinion. The idea of, like, I've become something greater as Springtrap, but I'm still here to put smiles on people's faces. I'm still here as the showman. Let me show you what I can do. I think that kind of a villain is so compelling for Five Nights at Freddy's. It kind of lines up in a human way with the core of the horror of FNAF, right? The horror of FNAF has always been the uncanny valley of an animatronic, something that is meant to be approachable and liked by children that is then twisted and made bad, either through the uncanniness of how they move or literally being possessed. And in a similar vein, is this villain, where the idea of a showman, someone just putting on a show for children, but that show is this psychopic murder, right? I think it's a really compelling narrative, and I think it fits really good with Five Nights at Freddy's and would make for a really solid villain. The problem is, if they take center stage as they would want to, that goes against what I think is the biggest strength of Five Nights at Freddy's. And that is, this villain, if in the plot, would make the plot of that game the story of that game, which is suddenly less compelling. It's suddenly just another horror game and not like a mystery to solve. which I think was always FNAF's biggest strength. So that being said, it would be a different direction, right? It would be a more pointed game for a more pointed plot line. But I think it is, I think we're due for it. I think my perfect FNAF villain is a copycat killer that is fully bloodline and possession-wise disconnected from William Afton, but inspired by what William Afton did. And inspired in a way where they want to put on the show again. They want to, have this eternal life, but in their way of doing it is just full-on showman. Big top hat, I think that would be a super compelling villain for a FNAF-styled game. And I would love to see that. This serial killer who the whole time is prancing around thinking they're putting on a performance. Thank you for your question, though. Our next one comes from Lincoln, him. I've been wanting to start a channel for a while, but it seems like a daunting task, especially since I have ADHD, and committing to big tasks is harder than just playing video games or something. Do you have any advice for that? Yeah, I've got plenty. First of all, I will say, listen to people who are smarter than me on this topic. I would recommend channels like Stream Scheme for if you want to go into streaming, or even not. Stream Scheme has just video-based stuff. But that's more for the creative side, what makes compelling content, things like that, and just general good practices. And I would also recommend channels like Finzar, Finzar, for editing tips. One of the best editors I've seen, and makes it really easy to understand tutorials. So, first of all, listen to people who are smarter than me. But as far as any advice I could give, not to Shia LaBeouf you, but just do it. I think any creative endeavor, the hardest part is starting. The hardest part of any creative endeavor is doing something you're bad at, right? Because I'm going to be super real. Unless you are an anomaly, if you've never done content before, you're going to make bad content. Just like if you've never drawn before, you're going to draw bad pictures. But you know how you draw really good pictures? You keep drawing. And the same thing goes for content. If you want to try out making a channel and making content, you just got to do it. And over time, you'll get better at it, You don't have to do it every single day. You don't have to grind at it. You make yourself miserable. I think the key for success in anything like this, creative-wise at all, is chase your joy and do what makes you happy. Because if it makes you happy doing it, you'll want to do it more. And the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. And definitely don't go into it wanting to make money. I would say I'm moderately successful at this whole YouTube game, and I am a very small percentile of people who have even got to this point, and it's very luck-based. I think the best analogy with it is luck is planning meets opportunity. So as far as growing content, there are definitely strategies to increase your odds. I know for the YouTube game, it's all about consistency, not necessarily frequency, how often can you upload, but just uploading the same time around the same part of the month, just consistently, so people know when things are going to be coming out, and YouTube will know when to push your channel. But as far as making it, quote unquote, it's the idea of, you can't force it to happen. So the most you can do is hone your craft, keep making stuff and getting better. And the more you put out, the less lucky you have to be to get an opportunity, right? You're increasing your odds, essentially. Luck is a skill, essentially, where you can get luckier the more opportunities you create for yourself. That and connect with people. Networking's awesome. And networking is such an icky word, the idea of I don't want to use people. Well, you're not, right? Networking shouldn't be seen as I'm reaching out to people to get something from them. Networking, if you, the best form of quote unquote networking is just genuinely reaching out to people who are, doing similar stuff to you or doing stuff you think is cool, and either just reaching out to form a connection or, offering some help or something. Like, do you have a skill you're really good at? Are you good at graphic design? You can reach out to people and be like, hey, I know your logos are a bit outdated. I do graphic design. I could do that for you if you'd like, and just like showing like I can do this skill for you, and just being kind. And it's not in expecting something in return, but you are planting seeds and you are putting yourself out there. You're helping people. You're putting good out in the world in the hopes that maybe one day good will come back to you, but never expected, right? And that's just called being a good person, essentially. But yeah, I guess that would be my advice is just do it, and it's going to be bad. A lot of people don't like getting into creative pursuits because of that fear of making something bad. And the thing that sucks about being good at creative pursuits is you just got to make bad stuff a lot until it gets better. And eventually it will, and just keep learning and keep making stuff. And my final piece of advice to move on after this is if you make something and look back and don't like what you've made, it means you've already improved because you can look at it and recognize what's wrong with it. So never make something and just go, oh, that stinked. That sucked. That stinks. I don't like it. Look back at it and try to figure out why you don't like it. Maybe you didn't like how you sounded. You spoke too fast. You didn't enunciate clearly enough. You didn't look at the camera. Eye contact is huge. So there's a lot of things like that where you can watch your own stuff. And if you don't like it, try to figure out why. And if you're not sure, that's fine. It takes a lot of practice and a lot of doing this to watch something and be like, oh, I didn't like it for this reason, this reason, this reason. And then you can work on those reasons. And then, yeah, and again, just chase what you love. Do it on a topic you could rant about forever. That's why I have a Nintendo channel, But I hope some of that was helpful. And thank you for your question, Lincoln. Our next question comes from Riki, she, her. Are there any theories that you regret making? No. I want to say, straight up, no. I don't regret making, if I truly regretted making a theory or a video, I probably would have taken it down. And I've never taken down a video that I've posted. Now I've made certain videos unlisted or private, but that was more like live streams that I wanted to shift the channel, or my old content on a older account that's not very good is private right now. But that, as far as a theory that I've posted, I've never taken it down or regretted making it. The only, Casey, don't mess with the lighting, you bastard. The closest thing, because at the end of the day, it's something I've made and I liked it. Yeah, there's plenty of theories. I'm not saying everything I've ever said is true. Not saying that at all. There are plenty of theories I've made that are wrong. Just straight up, provably wrong. And there's plenty of theories I've made that at the time of making it, I'm like, I don't know if I believe this, but it's worthwhile to have the conversation, And I've said that often in the video itself. A lot of my more egregious theories, I've said, I don't know if I, in the outro, I'll be like, I don't know if I believe this theory, but I think it's useful to have the conversation. And that's a lot of theorizing, right? It's making theories. You don't make a theory to try to prove it's true. I don't think anyone should only make theories to be right. That's not, how that works in my brain. In my brain, it's we have all this discordant information. A lot of the times, making theories is a way to brainstorm and a way to see things from new perspectives. And you can make a theory that you think is false, but it might help you think about something in a different way that might get you closer to what you think is true. So even theories that at the time of making them, I was like, I don't think this is true. I don't regret making that theory or that video because it's still helpful to have the conversation. I do have some specific regrets inside of videos, and typically that comes down to just me forgetting about a key piece of evidence that either proves or disproves something that I said, or at least more heavily supports it. Here's a one from literally last week, the Elizabeth video that I just made. T-Dreads, friend of the channel, messaged me after and said, "Oh, did you not mention this one quote for a specific reason, or did you just forget?" I didn't even know it existed, which it's a huge piece of evidence for that theory. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick. In the Ennard fight, one of the rare quotes that Ennard can say at you is, "I know it was an accident," which like is huge evidence that during that fight, Elizabeth knows about the bite of 83, which is, Michael caused it, but it was an accident, like that's huge evidence. Does it prove the theory? No, because that takes place during Sister Location, which definitely is after 83, but it at least proves that Elizabeth knows about the bite of 83, which is huge. So, that she could have still been alive and then died with that knowledge, like it doesn't prove that she died before the crying child or anything, but it's something that I regretted not putting in the theory because I think it really helps the narrative that I was building in that video. But yeah, actually, I take it all back. There's one video I do regret. After my first FNAF timeline, like the very first FNAF video I posted, that timeline, like kind of semi blew up. I immediately followed it up with a nothing on the next week, and then a video about my predictions for the Sonic 2 movie, which crushed any momentum I had on that first video. And it took me like 7 months to get momentum on that channel again. So if I regret anything, it's doing a Sonic video as my second video on the channel to kill my momentum immediately. But we got it back, so it's okay. And you know what? I don't regret that video because I was right. I was so goddamn right about everything I said about the Sonic 2 movie, except for literally like one thing. What? I was right. And I predicted it before. Sorry, Amanda's laughing at me because I'm getting on my high horse. I predicted that whole plot before they even announced Knuckles was gonna be in it. And I called Knuckles was gonna be in it. I called that, like, I was so right.
You did the same thing with the third movie too, but you didn't make it a video.
Yeah, I didn't make it a video, but with the third movie, I was also very correct with it. But I feel like the third movie was easier to guess because it's like we knew Shadow was going to be in it. So it's like, oh, okay, so it's Sonic Adventure 2. And it basically was just Sonic Adventure 2 with like some characters removed and some things changed. I will say, I've said this before. Now that we know it's Metal Sonic, Sonic CD is probably the blueprint for Sonic 4. But the only question is like, there's multiple Metal Sonic, which is weird. I'm not going to go that far onto a tangent, but yeah. Thank you for your question. The last question I have pulled up, what time are we at? Because there was a big gap in here. We're at 45, but we're missing about 6 to 7 minutes. So yeah, this will probably be our last question. It's from Draku, he, him. Just have a little question about your timeline. But you have said in the past that you believe Cassie beats one Balloon World arcade cabinet and her dad beats the other to free Gregory. But in Security Breach itself, we know that one person has to be at the Princess Quest cabinets in order to free Vanessa. As per duffel bag message, the guy says he beat the first two but can't find the third. But Gregory has to beat all three. Maybe I'm misunderstanding how you're saying it, but I find your explanation of Cassie and her dad both beating separate cabinets to free Gregory contradicted. Thank you for your question. Yeah, you're right. Straight up. I kind of forgot about that working that way in the duffel bag message. That is a really good counter argument to me saying that Cassie beats it in the daycare and her dad beats it in the basement, and it works. Part of me is like, I don't know why it's person dependent, but you raise a great point that like it's saying it is person dependent, that even though somebody beat Princess Quest 1 and 2, Gregory still has to beat all three himself to free Vanessa. So I would say there's two possibilities. One counter-argument to your counter-argument is maybe it's just time-based, and, he beat 1 and 2, never finished the job, and by then they've remade 1 and 2. Totally possible that's just time-based. But assuming you're right, and that it does need to be the same person, that does pretty heartily disprove my theory that Cassie beats the one in the daycare and her dad beats the one in the basement, and that's why Gregory is free. So I guess my pivot would be, I still think the Balloon World arcade in the basement is the one that is beaten that frees Gregory, and I still think Cassie's dad does that. I think the fact that the Balloon World arcade machine in the arcade loft is accessible at all is probably just knowledge, not necessarily canon, right? So let's think, what do I mean by that? To access it, we have to do this weird camera puzzle that doesn't make any logical sense. So that might be our first hint that what we see in that room isn't directly happening in game. It's one of those things that's like, does this exist? Yes. Is it currently happening in game? And does Gregory do it? No. Kind of like how I think probably the CDs work. Do those physical CDs of the logs of Vanessa's therapy exist in the Pizzaplex? Probably not. But it is lore that we can receive, and that's like the video gamey aspect of it, right? Unless we're trying to say that everything we see in Security Breach is literally true, which I think is a stretch. I think some things we can take as, this is knowledge for the player. This isn't actively happening in the plot. We're not actively collecting therapy CDs that are scattered about the Pizzaplex. You know, you could use the argument they are digital manifestations, which is probably true because the whole AR vision, but it's still strange and like doesn't quite make sense. So all this to say, the arcade in the daycare loft, if what you're saying is true, which I think you're right, if the arcade is in the daycare loft and only accessible with this weird camera puzzle, it's probably most likely that that arcade cabinet is instead showing us how Gregory's mind was taken over. That, you know, maybe he was wearing the VANNI mask at the time or not, who knows, but it's the idea of playing this arcade machine, finding the glitch, following the glitch, and I believe, let me do a quick Google, but I believe Eclipse says good night. Yeah, Eclipse says good night, and then it crashes. That does, to me, feel like somebody's mind is being taken over, right? Having this small child in the center of the screen, this overwhelming presence, and then just good night. That does feel like a you've been taken over moment. So if that, and also the arcade machine is playable in Security Breach, which is a whole nother layer on top of it. When these arcade machines are beaten, they're not playable anymore, which is why I think it's important that the Balloon World one in the basement isn't playable anymore. So since getting to the loft doesn't make logical sense, and it might just be this is information for the player, not necessarily for Gregory, this arcade cabinet might be showing us what took over Gregory's mind in the first place. He was playing this arcade machine, he followed the glitch, literally going down the rabbit hole, and eventually this overwhelming presence just good nights him. And then that's when his mind is taken over. So I guess that would be my pivot. If Cassie beating it doesn't make logical sense to free Gregory, with the duffel bag message making it implied that the same person has to beat it. Like I said, that, or it's a time-based thing. That's somebody beat the first two, but too much time had gone past, never found the third one, they remade the first two. Both are possible. I think both are very likely. I don't know which one I line up on, but that is a good counter-argument. I'm glad you brought it up. So thank you for your question. And yeah, I think we've hit about 45 minutes, probably. So again, if you want your questions answered on the podcast, feel free to send them into Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast at gmail.com. That is in the description to copy and paste because it's a pain to type out. But until next time, as always, thank you for watching the Freddy Fazbear Pizza Podcast, where the pizza abilities are endless. We hope to enjoy your future patronage. Bye-bye for now.